Okay, this is a continuation of quite a few years of work on the railroad construction workers, not construction workers, mainly maintenance workers on the Central Pacific, largely in Utah, but also continuing on into Nevada and California. The construction of the Central Pacific portion of the transcontinental from Sacramento to Promontory Summit was largely done by the labor provided by contracted Chinese immigrants. Thousands of Chinese men, most of them coming directly from China, were hired by the CP, or more accurately by general agent companies such as the Sisson-Wallace Company, for the tasks of clearing, grading, blasting, and track laying to create a viable railroad. After the railroad was completed, the CP still needed a large force of men to continue the construction work, and more importantly, maintain and enhance what was already built. The CP retained some European American labor, largely Irish, English, and American in management, foremen, and skilled positions. It also chose to retain many of the Chinese laborers, likely those who had worked most diligently and had learned important skills during construction. Few narratives on the transcontinental construction and maintenance have focused on the type of shelter available to the army of railroad workers. Certainly there were places such as Ogden, Corinne, Kelton, and Terrace in Utah, and Wells, Carlin, Elko, Winnemucca, and Reno in Nevada, which had hotels and boarding houses that could accommodate some workers. Such places were expensive, and the railroad would be reluctant to pay for such accommodations except for senior employees of the company. There was also a need to spread evenly spread out the labor, including the very remote areas of the far-flung railroad. In the first few decades of railroad operations, section stations were placed every 8 to 12 miles along the route to cover the often heavy maintenance work on the track. There were also larger stations with shops and an even larger labor pool. There was a need to provide both with low-cost accommodations. The nature of employee housing along the CP is identified in numerous railroad documents now held at the California State Railroad Museum Library and Archives in Sacramento. The drawings show dozens of houses, outbuildings, bunkhouses, and other railroad facilities spread along the railroad from east of Sacramento to Ogden, Utah. The drawings themselves have no specific dates, though the collections themselves are dated circa 1880. Up to now, my default position has been to follow those dates for establishing timeframes for the structures in the drawings. Despite extensive research, I have not been able to verify that the 1880 date reflects the age of the structures, and that is definitely true for the section station building itself. It is known that most section station buildings date to 1869. The bunkhouses and cookhouses are another matter. Some section drawings have penciled in changes which provide a hint that at least some bunkhouse and cookhouse buildings may date earlier in time. For instance, Gravel Pit, Utah, an original 1869 station drawing shows that in 1881, the section house was sold, the China bunkhouse burned, and the handcar house was moved. The implication here is that such a disposition of valuable structures would not likely have occurred the year after construction if 1880 is the correct date for these maps. Also, it's known that the section house at Gravel Pit existed in 1869. Another set of important documents lists buildings by railroad division from Sacramento to Promontory dated August 1869. These lists provide station names and show buildings at those stations along with overall dimensions, and for some stations, some other structural information. For purposes of this discussion concerning housing, the most common type of building described is section house, for which there are 49, 3 in California, 37 in Nevada, and 9 in Utah. The second most common structure shown is telegraph office, which likely also served as a residence. There was a total of 22 of these, 17 in Nevada and 5 in Utah. 5 other dwelling types are also mentioned at different stations, though only one of each. Interestingly, even though virtually every section station along the route included at least 10 to 20 Chinese workers, in larger stations even more, this list does not mention housing for them. Of course, this document was compiled only 3 months after the completion of the railroad, when few buildings had been completed. The list of buildings in the 1869 document were compared against many of the circa 1880 drawings held by the California Museum and were found to be identical. Also, both foreman and track worker housing depicted in the two albums has been verified archaeologically at many stations, including Rye Patch and Pequot in Nevada, and Bovine, Matlin, Colmar, Saco, Ombe, and Terrace in Utah. The question that has remained is whether track and shop worker housing had been constructed at or near the same time as all the section stations and other shops, tanks, stations, tool houses, sheds, and pipelines, or whether track and shop workers were relegated to finding their own shelter until the next decade. Trivial as that question may sound, it's important in understanding the station layouts over time, social dynamics of remote railroad communities, and even what accommodations were provided for track and shop workers before 1880. It would not even be an issue were records found documenting it. Over the last several years, I've done deep research into the CP documents at many institutions. During COVID-19 quarantine, I spent even more time accessing online sources. Three of the most important sources were the annual reports of the CP from 1869 to the 1890s, reports of the Secretary of the Interior from 1869 to 1877, and reports of the Commissioner of Railroads to the Secretary of the Interior from 1878 to 1893. These sources and others occasionally made mention of housing for foremen and other supervisory personnel, but none mentioned what accommodations were made for the housing of track workers, shop workers, and other laborers, even though much of the railroad lay in remote desert and mountains, far from where laborers, primarily Chinese during the 19th century, might expect to find shelter not otherwise furnished by the railroad. Such housing was also not mentioned in the many travel guides and diaries that I've been able to see for the 1870s period. The fact that housing for laborers was not mentioned is not uncommon, especially for Chinese workers. Maintenance personnel were often invisible to those who wrote reports, and racist attitudes about Chinese just added to the mix. Still, Chinese worker housing was called out on the Union Pacific lines at several stations in Wyoming. They were often described as tenement houses during the same time. My fallback position on this question was that, like some other railroads, perhaps the CP provided railroad cars set off on detached sidings for their workers. I found no documentary or archaeological evidence that these were used for house workers or to house workers. Another thought, perhaps the workers continued to live in dugouts and in ramshackle shacks as they did during the construction. Both documentary and archaeological research produced no evidence to support it. Dugout structures are known at many locations along the railroad line in Utah and Nevada, but none of these sites suggest long-term occupation. Yet another line of evidence was found in searching Commissioner of Railroads reports on 14 20-mile segments of an SP railroad constructed south from San Jose, California to Yuma, Arizona during the 1870s, which would eventually become the second transcontinental railroad in the United States. These reports were required for railroads which had taken loans and land grants from the federal government. Of the 14 reports completed on the line, only the two earliest ones described facilities for the Chinese, these along two 20-mile lines. And you can see this in the slide there, where I identify one that existed near Tulare, and they talked about a house for Chinese laborers, 14 by 24 feet, built of wood and covered with shingles, and another one in 1873 in the next section down near Delano, where another 14 by 24 foot house for Chinese laborers was built and with wood and covered with shingles. An unpublished report by Larry Mullally entitled The Fabric of the Southern Pacific Railroad, 1872 to 1880, housing described within the 12 additional commissioners' reports on that railroad line. Mullally identified an additional 25 bunkhouses at as many stations. but none of those mentioned that bunkhouses were specifically for Chinese, though it is known that Chinese were prominently hired for such work well into the 1880s. Rather, track worker housing is described more generically, perhaps considering increasing anti-Chinese sentiment at the time. The construction work was ordered and carried out by the same railroad workers who built and operated the Central Pacific Line from San Francisco to Ogden in the 1870s. That's the second transcontinental line. The dimensions of the worker housing on both the California and the California line and the transcontinental lines are quite similar. The comparison here is striking and strongly suggests that worker housing on the transcontinental line was also built at or near the same time as foreman housing, shops, and other infrastructure in 1869 or the early 1870s. In corroboration of the two reports listing houses for Chinese laborers, yet another source shows additional Chinese railroad worker presence on this second transcontinental line down in California. An archaeological study of Ogleby Station in Imperial County, California notes that the town was established by the SP in 1877. A China bunkhouse and China cookhouse are shown on an SP sketch map of the town located near the Arizona-California line. Recently, archaeological evidence has come to light which strongly supports an early date for Chinese bunkhouses, Chinese cookhouses, and similar named structures along the CP route. In 2020, the Utah State Historic Preservation Office, in partnership with the Bureau of Land Management, initiated a Passport in Time project at the railroad town site of Terrace, Utah. Along with volunteers and the assistance of the Chinese Railroad Workers Descendants Association, they focused a large part of their efforts on excavation of a potential structure in the informal Chinatown portion of Terrace, Utah. In this year, both GPR survey data and evidence of a possible structure suggested by exposed wooden posts, the crew was able to excavate a house. In 2021, this same structure was completely exposed, revealing the first excavated Chinese house in Utah, and likely the first along the entire original transcontinental line in Utah, Nevada, and California. The wooden structure, and by the way, this image right here is a LiDAR image that was taken of that structure. The wooden structure measured 10 feet by 7 feet in size and had at least one door and one window. It was constructed of vertical planks of lumber, likely reclaimed from railroad operations. No nails were found. The floors consisted of 6-inch and 12-inch wide parallel milled planks set on native sandy soil. The wood includes Douglas fir, redwood, and some type of pine, materials found in other structures, trestles, and ties along the route. And here is something unique. Thanks to the ever creative Chris Merritt, we have an artist's conception of what this house may have looked like. I don't know of any other image that we have of this. I've never been able to find housing images for Chinese housing or bunkhouses of any sort on this line. CP drawings of the terrace house, of the terrace station, provided the location of the railroad constructed Chinese bunkhouses and cookhouse. From the extensive work done during field work in Terrace and over the last 2 years, it's evident that the excavated house and other adjacent house foundations identified were in the immediate vicinity of the railroad provided China bunkhouse and cookhouse. The nature of the wood materials found that formed the house strongly indicate they were salvaged materials, probably from scrap piles that were scattered throughout the town as the shops, tanks, station, and other buildings were being constructed in the spring and summer of 1869, or perhaps slightly later. They were a wide assortment of sizes and types of wood. As such, it would appear both the railroad constructed bunkhouse and the cookhouse and buildings of what later became an informal terrace Chinatown were of near simultaneous construction. In Terrace, the maintenance crews, like those crews at more remote stations, would have lived in the bunkhouse and used the cookhouse for their needs. It's also likely that, depending on space availability, the remainder of the Chinese labor force, those working the shops, may have also lived in the bunkhouse. Some shop workers and other Chinese and terrorists may have constructed their own houses from salvaged materials and perhaps some items they could afford to purchase. Following is a view of the terrace rail yard, and on the left, the coal house with an open back wall. Through that opening, one can see perhaps the only existing view of at least a portion of Terrace Chinatown in 1880. We seem to have a smoking gun, yet there is still no direct evidence from either documents or from archaeology that the Central Pacific built bunkhouses and cookhouses for Chinese as early as 1869 or even 1870 or 1871. However, indirect evidence is most persuasive. It's my belief that it is only a matter of time before engineering documents, diaries, or archaeological evidence is discovered that will make it certain. That is so hard to prove, and it is so hard to prove is annoying in the extreme, but it's likely that there are documents that still exist to help make that a certainty. Why it is so difficult is another question. There is every indication that the protocol of railroad supervisory personnel was to largely tolerate Chinese workers who carried out the bulk of labor tasks on the line. It is consistent with the segregation of section stations, including terrace, though it may be possible that the Chinese themselves also desired such distances kept. At every station on the route, the Chinese accommodations were at least 100 to as much as 1,000 feet distant from the foreman's quarters, with few exceptions. While bunkhouses were provided for Chinese track workers, though they probably were required to pay for the privilege, the terrace house excavation results revealing a house built of scrap lumber strongly suggest that at least some Chinese shop workers and other Chinese in terrace in Kelton and Corinne, Utah, and at Carlin, Toano, and many other facilities in Nevada may have needed to find and build their own accommodations, at least in the first decade or two of railroad operations. And I would just add to this, since I've been here at the SHA, I went out to Valley Forge and looked at some of the cabins that had been built there by the soldiers in the winter of 1877. They all had three high bunks. We had not even been thinking about that, which would, if that was the case here, it would have allowed for quite a few more men to be accommodated in these bunkhouses, and that's something else we're going to be looking at in the future. Trying to find some better information about how these interiors might have been operated. But for now, that's it. Thank you.